yourself up some asshole stew, grab a glass of Johnny Walker Red, and let's dive into this month's harrowing horror. Hi friends, and welcome back to Cammy's Corner and another installment of Harrowing Horror. Today we are taking a look at Swan Song, written by Robert McCammon. Its publication year was 1987. It is the co-winner of the 1987 Bram Stoker Award and nominated for the 1988 World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. It is McCammon's first book to hit the New York Times bestseller list. The genre is apocalyptic horror. It is written in third-person omniscient, multiple place settings, but a few that definitely stand out are going to be Washington, D.C., New York City, Kansas, and Idaho. The year is unspecified, however, it is written to be understood as modern day present. Now, based on the timeline, that would run you from the late 80s to the mid-90s. It is broken down into two books, comprised of 14 parts, broken down into 95 chapters, all encompassed into 956 pages. Its price range will be anywhere from about $3 for a used mass market paperback, and the most expensive one I could find this go around was about $1,700 on eBay. That is for a lettered edition with a wooden slipcase and signed by McCammon himself. So your ISBN number, of course, is going to vary based on your publication date, and your writing style is informal. There has not been a movie made of this novel to date, but during my research, I was able to discover a tribute film that was created back in 2013-14, somewhere in that area. It is titled The Road to Wasteland. It is a tribute to Robert McCammon's Swan Song. It runs about 3 minutes and 19 seconds, and it was created for Wasteland Weekend of 2014. Now, the way it's set up, I'm guessing that's probably like a local Comic-Con. Its filmmakers are Danny and Danelle Waters, and I will leave a link to that video in my description below. It's definitely worth the checkout. Now, of course, I'm not going to go verbatim, part for part, chapter for chapter, because we would be here all day. But there are some significant things that stand out that I definitely want to dive into. Of course, let's go ahead and initially break down the book's parts and chapters so we kind of know what we're diving into. So it is broken down into book 1 and book 2. Book 1 is comprised of 47 chapters. Book 2 has 48 chapters. Book 1 has parts 1 through 7. Book 2 is comprised of parts 8 through 14. Part 1, titled The Point of No Return, comprised of chapters 1 through 5. Part 2, Burning Spears, chapters 6 to 11. Part 3, Lights Out, chapters 12 to 18. Part 4, Land of the Dead, chapters 19 through 26. Part 5, Will of Fortune Tourney, chapters 27 to 33. Part 6, Hell Freezes, chapters 34 to 40. Part 7, Thinking About Tomorrow, chapters 41 to 47. This is where we dive into book 2. Part 8 is Toad Frog with Golden Wings, chapters 48 to 54. Part 9, The Fountain and the Fire, chapters 55 to 58. Part 10, Seeds, chapters 59 to 63. Part 11, Daughter of Ice and Fire, chapters 64 to 69. Part 12, True Faces, chapters 70 to 74. Part 13, A Five-Star General, chapters 75 to 84. And lastly, Part 14, A Prayer for the Final Hour, chapters 85 to 95. Now, something unique to be said about the first 11 chapters. You will not see the same reference of the familiar timeline after chapter 11. So beginning with chapter 1 all the way through chapters 11, you have a very definitive timeline over the span of 2 days, July 16th and July 17th. This really sets you up for your story. Once you hit chapter 12, they're simply comprised of the name, chapter 12, chapter 13, so on and so forth. But the titling of the grouping of chapters is very important to kind of know more or less what you're going to be discussing and kind of where you're at within a book. When you have a book of this caliber and this size with this many characters, it's important to have that kind of structure because it helps you as the reader to follow along. The point of view of the storytelling here with the third person omniscient point of view is so important to us as the reader because it really does help us to segue between each of the characters, and in addition to that, when we come back to that certain character or those certain sets of characters, it's like picking up right where we left off, despite the fact that they might be hundreds of miles apart or in completely separate states. So our novel opens up to a very distinct timeline. We have an unspecified year that basically, with the writing style of McCammon, puts us right there with the president and his advisors as he's discussing how the Soviet Union is essentially building up its forces to preempt nuclear strike. Now we can take back the fear of Russia all the way to 1949. Harry S. Truman was president of the United States, and this is when the talk of Russia and the potential possibilities of a nuclear invasion at some point happening. Segue that into the 1950s, or early 1960s. There was all the talk and all the rage of the potential World War III, the end is coming, you know, Judgment Day is near. And so even at this time, based on the average household income, it was very feasible for a regular American family, middle class, to build a bomb shelter in their basement. You were essentially taking a structure that already existed in your home, and for a very small price of $150 to $200, you could convert that into a bomb shelter. Now, by no stretch of the means is it anything that would really withstand a nuclear fallout, because the way these were constructed, they were very small, confined, tight spaces. Yes, you can inevitably pack a great number of bodies in there, but there wasn't a lot of storage containment for food rations, water supply, fresh water supply, restroom usage, and then they didn't really take into consideration the air quality factor. The air circulation was actually done by a hand cranking. So think about that. In the event of an actual nuclear invasion, you have fallout dust in the air as it's settling. You're cycling out whatever good oxygen that you have contained in this basement, which is already small. And what type of air are you going to circulate back in? So they didn't really think it through. But of course, you put fear out there and people immediately, as consumers, want to absorb that, and they, you know, have that scare tactic inside them. What do I need to buy? What do I need to stockpile just so myself and my family can be safe? So you had all of this creation. That segues us into the Cold War. And inevitably, the fall of the Berlin Wall didn't happen until 1989. So all of this, with the timestamp of this book, is very real. It's very believable. You have a deterioration of a relationship between two countries that were never really allies to begin with. And you have very extensive formal talks of the advisors to the president. You have the vice president, you have the Department of Defense in there, and everybody's talking strategy. So this really gets you excited and set up. Now, if you take that to the end of chapter 1, there is a prominent phrase that you will hear repetitively from the president, and that is A-OK. Anytime that a phrase is used repetitively and in very close proximity to each other, you always want to pay attention to that. It's little details like that that take you far, but you don't want to overthink it, and you certainly don't want to read too far ahead and kind of ruin that for yourself. Now, I will continue to segue the timestamps and locations up through chapter 12, and then of course I'm just kind of going to lay out the story as it unfolds. Chapter 2, we're at 11:19 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We find ourselves now in New York City. This is where we are introduced to Sister Creep. Now, Sister Creep is a homeless woman who suffered a mental breakdown after a devastating accident, an accident in which caused the death of her daughter due to a drunk driving incident. Of course, this weighs very heavy on her. I wouldn't say that her mental breakdown in any sense of the way makes her a head case. She's not schizophrenic or anything of that nature, but she's definitely depressed and down on her luck. So she's essentially living and trying to survive on the streets of New York, which in and of itself is a very ravaged area. Let's fast forward to chapter 3, 10:22 p.m. Central Standard Time. We now find ourselves in Concordia, Kansas, and the introduction of Joshua Hutchins. Joshua Hutchins is described immediately as Black Frankenstein. He is a wrestler, he is an entertainer, but he is not exactly what he seems. He comes across in his original explanation as a very large man, very powerful, very mean, but then with that initial first fight that he encounters with the other wrestler, you can see that he does have an underlying heart of gold. His concern is to make sure that that other wrestler gets to the hospital and gets the attention that he needs. So he bows out of the fight and kind of takes it with saving grace. Josh will inevitably become a very important part of this story. We now segue into chapter 4, where it is 11:48 p.m. Central Standard Time near Wichita, Kansas. We are then introduced to Darlene Prescott, who is the single mother of Suwanda, otherwise known as Swan Prescott. Inevitably, of course, she does become the true heroine of our tale. Darlene has a very colorful past, to put it mildly. She, of course, has done things such as bar matron. She has been a topless dancer. All of the relationships are seemingly very chaotic. There seems to be a pattern with abusive, controlling relationships. Uncle Tommy is no different. As we hone in on this mother-daughter and their trailer park conditions, we see that Swan has a very unique gift. She has a green thumb. Gardening is one of her insane talents. She's very gifted in keeping plants alive, and not only does she keep them alive, but they blossom and they flourish beyond expectation. This is something to definitely hone in on and kind of keep locked away. She is the ripe old age of 9. This leads us into something that I found to be very exciting. Chapter 5, 11:50 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, takes us to Blue Dome Mountain, Idaho. So if you, like me, are a conspiracy theorist, this may have given you spine-tingling chills immediately and made you think of none other than the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex, if you're not familiar, was made fully operational in the late 60s. Essentially, it is a NORAD complex that is literally located inside a mountain range in the southwest corner of Colorado Springs. Now, where it fits into conspiracy theorists, because there's no denying that this place actually exists. It's been photographed, it's been discussed. But because of ongoing operational and security requirements, Cheyenne Mountain is not open to the general public, and it does not do any tours and such things. So the conspiracy theory comes in that this particular complex was built and is maintained in the event that America should succumb to a nuclear war and have nuclear fallout, that the president will then be taken from the White House to this complex. Now, don't let that be confused with PEOC. Now, PEOC is the Presidential's Emergency Operations Center located in the White House. Now, there is conflicting information given that it's located either in the East or West Wing. It is believed to be located in the basement of the West Wing. So essentially what would transpire is if a nuclear war did occur, then the president would then be taken to the PEOC. From the PEOC, all of the situational discussions like we see in chapter 1 would transpire, take place. All of the conversations and the buildup leading to that moment would then segue into whatever plan of strategy that they had. The president would then be taken from the PEOC to Air Force One, and from Air Force One taken over to the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. In addition to our president, we would also segue in the vice president, their respective families, any members of the cabinet that the president and vice president saw fit. So you would probably have the Secretary of Defense, whatever general is leading the army at the time. And then, in further conspirizing the conspiracy, it is also said to believe that there is a list of names of people that would be allotted access to the complex as the chosen ones to continue on the human race. So no one really knows how it's broken down, if it's a genetics code, if it's by race, by superiority, by gender. I'm sure it is a mix of everything, but to think that a multi-billion-dollar complex does not have some type of truth to all that conspiracy would just be silly. But Earth House, which is what we are introduced to in Swan Song, is to me what a mirror image would be of the Cheyenne Mountain complex. We are also then introduced to 3 characters here, 2 of which aren't as significant, but they do definitely play a role in the 3rd. So we have Phil and Elise Crowinger, who are the parents of Ronald. They are coming in from Flagstaff, Arizona to the Blue Dome Mountain in Idaho, and in this car ride, you have 13-year-old Roland Crowinger, who is extremely excited about where they're heading. So there has been some conversation amongst the family. Now, it's understood from the text of the writing that Phil is some kind of data analyst, and so obviously he's being taken to this Earth House in the event of this upcoming impending crisis / war between the Soviet Union and the United States. There is a very prominent situation that transpires in the vehicle prior to reaching the gate of the Earth House complex. Notice I just called it a complex. So Roland is in the back seat kind of going through the events that are about to play out, and he remembers that he had a .357 Magnum. He begins to kind of frantically search the vehicle for it, reaches up under the seat, and to his calm, he discovers it. However, one would think that the discovery of the gun would be enough, but not for Roland. He then proceeds to take the gun out of underneath the seat and point it not only at his mom, but at his father as well. And by doing so, with each point blank stare, he uses the term bang, bang. Now at the second bang, which is directed towards his father says, "Hey, quit messing around like that, you need to put the gun away." So then he gathers the gun and stows it under the seat. But you have to wonder, okay, first of all, this kid is only 13. That is one sadistic little shithead. If you can take a gun, which is probably loaded, and point it at not one but both of your parents, and then use the word bang like it's a game, it kind of makes you wonder about this kid. So when they finally reach the gates of Earth House, they come across another soldier, and Phil starts asking some very important questions as far as where they're going. And the soldier then indicates, you know, everything will be sorted out, at which point the name Colonel James Jimbo Macklin comes up for the first time. Roland gets very excited because this kid has done his homework. In addition to being very gun savvy and a gun enthusiast, he's also very military interested and military driven. So he has done his homework on Colonel Macklin. He knows that he is a war veteran of the Vietnam War, and he pretty much can cite for you every accomplishment that Colonel Macklin has done in his time in service. So all of that will be very valuable down the road. This leads us into chapter 6 and what would be the next day, July 17th, 4:40 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, New York City. And we are then introduced to the man who liked movies. Now, you can kind of base this however you want. I see the man who liked movies as a potential other face for the man with the scarlet eye. It doesn't really come out and say it, but the placing is right and the sadistic scene is right. So you have the man who liked movies sitting in a dark movie theater, insisting repetition on the same movie. Now, I don't know if you are like me and you have seen the series. I believe it's a 11 or 12 part series of a movie called The Faces of Death. And it is just as it states. It's essentially a documentary-like film of different deathly occurrences throughout the world. And you see some very grotesque things, such as suicides, you see people jump to their death, you see beheadings. So this is not for the faint of heart. The movie that is referenced in the book is The Many Faces of Death. So I'm thinking that it is premised after that video series. But to want to sit in a dark movie theater all alone and want to watch these types of events over and over only feeds the need for sinister. Chapter 7 takes us into a 10:16 a.m. timestamp, Eastern Standard Time, New York City, where we once again are greeted by Sister Creep. Now here, Sister Creep starts to walk around New York City. She's walking around in the ravages and remains of what would appear to have already been a radioactive storm. So New York has already onset. So you're going to start to see the wave of this nuclear war begin. Sister Creep finds a glass ring encased in jewels, and by seeing it, she decides to go ahead and pick it up and hold on to it because she does believe that there is some value and importance to it. Through this discovery, she ends up actually meeting up with the man with the scarlet eye. She's able to escape. She runs away through the hazardous Holland Tunnel, and she is able to segue from New York into New Jersey. Chapter 8 leads us back to Blue Dome Mountain. The timestamp on that is 8:31 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. So we're back in Idaho, and we're getting a inside glimpse of Colonel Macklin before the hit. We kind of get a very dark inside look to the Colonel, in that there's one line that really stands out with me. Deep inside him, in the pit where no light had shone for a very long time, the shadow soldier cried out with joy. Now this is kind of coming to terms with his place, his responsibility, and understanding the significant importance of what Earth House is, and that inevitably he's in charge of this. So you start to kind of see that sinister smile prevail, and the darkness within becomes apparent. What we do also see with Colonel Macklin is we do get more of a perspective of his military career, but also a clear understanding that he feels up to this point he really hasn't been respected, and his career really isn't over. It's very evident that he's very arrogant, very egotistical. He thinks very highly of himself, but he also realizes that there's an importance to be had with this uniform. There is a lot of correlation as we start to see the darker and darker onset of Colonel Macklin and Roland Kroeninger of a Nazi regime tie-in. So although we are on the brink of nuclear war and Holocaust, there is always the onset of the supreme evil, and that is Adolf Hitler. Segueing into chapter 9, 10:46 a.m. Central Standard Time, we are reintroduced to Joshua Hutchins, which we'll just at this point call Josh. He is on his way to Garden City, and he begins to have some vehicle trouble in the Pontiac Bonneville that he's driving. So he decides not to take the chance, but instead to exit. He sees a billboard sign that says Pawpaw Gas, and from here this takes him to a convenience store that Pawpaw runs, and inevitably we have the merge of him, Darlene, as well as Swan. Now when we last left Darlene and Swan, they had decided that Uncle Tommy and the trailer park life was just not for them. So Darlene said, you know what, I'm just gonna pack up whatever small belongings we have, and basically we're just gonna head out and start over. So you do get the understanding that they've probably done this quite often, and Swan is just very familiar with it. Here at the gas station, they have a run-in with Josh as he's talking with Pawpaw. They're just kind of doing some small talk. Obviously, as a convenience store owner, this is probably something he does frequently. And Swan notices the size and stature of Josh, and she proceeds to ask him a very blunt question, which most children do. And she says, "How big are you?" To which Josh is kind of amused and taken aback by that. And of course, Darlene is flabbergasted, and you know, we don't talk to strangers that way, but Josh entertains it and they begin conversing. Somewhere in that conversation, Darlene and Swan get separated as Pawpaw opens up what appears to be like a basement area, and Darlene needs to use the restroom. So at this point, Darlene and Swan are not together. Pawpaw and Josh are still conversing. Swan is kind of in the mix at this point, and then the feelings start happening. So this is where you get an insight that Swan is just a little bit more than just a green thumb little girl. She makes a reference to how quiet things are. Now, before any type of natural disaster, it has always been referenced. People say this is the quiet before the storm, because it is a very true statement. Things get very hush-hush. Animals start acting very strange. This happened back in 2011, 2012 with that huge tsunami that hit. It started by the onset of an earthquake that created a tsunami, but there was numerous eyewitness testimony stating the behavior of animals was apparent days before the actual event occurred. Here, Josh had explained 2 to 3 days prior his car was covered in locusts. Anyone who knows about religious tie-ins to the end of the world and to Judgment Day knows that locusts are a telltale sign that the end is near. So he's referencing this while Swan is referencing the quiet and the animal behavior. So we have large flocks of birds, we have horses running around skittishly, we have dogs baying at the sky, and Swan senses something is about to happen. So she whispers the word danger. In addition to whispering this, she specifically says danger in the corn. This is the first area around them that will be the onset of the nuclear war beginning. So about 400 yards out from the gas station, the corn stalks begin to burst like popcorn. And so you have these burning spears coming up from the ground, and then you have bursts of light in the air. What feels like an earthquake, and then complete darkness. Within milliseconds, Pawpaw has burst into flames. So World War III has begun. So that immediately takes us then into chapter 10. We have a timestamp of 10:17 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. We are back at Earth House, and we know that we've already begun the understanding that World War III has begun from that perspective. So now we're going to see what happens with Earth House. Earth House is supposed to be the impenetrable fortress, much like Cheyenne Mountain. Nothing can penetrate the walls. They are built to last, and they are built to last the fortitude of any type of attack. So the order has been sealed. McCammon now has his assignment. His number one objective is to ensure that all the people are structured the way that they should be. But very quickly, the impenetrable fortress begins to destroy. So it starts much like we see at the gas station. We have an earthquake situation that eventually turns into bursts of light and then complete darkness. Phil and Elise Krolinger do in fact perish, leaving Roland as an orphan. He quickly takes on the search for a father type figure and sees that immediately in Colonel McCammon. Colonel McCammon has kind of a father feeling towards Roland. He likes his ambition, he likes his drive. He can definitely see that his determination is very similar to his own. So he does instantly take Roland under his wing. There is mass chaos and destruction around them. The APB is pretty much put out just to understand that all of your relatives have probably been vaporized at this point. They're gone as quickly as the fireball hit. And then for the first time, you kind of get the biblical references here. So there is a stop that's stated, multiple S's. So you get this like a snake, like a slither, and that is in reference to the shadow soldier. Now, I find the irony in that the shadow soldier was referenced to specifically Colonel McCammon. So you wonder at that point, are they one and the same? Or is this sinister dark being just an entity? Or is this kind of like a double side that we are seeing of Colonel McCammon? Chapter 11 has a timestamp then of 1:31 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this is really the last specific direction that we see before we segue into the individual stories. We are aboard Airborne Command. We are then revisited by the President of the United States. Here we also have the Secretary of Defense, Hannon, and kind of what I was saying, it's pretty much that flight to the finish. So you have the President aboard what would be Air Force One. They're still talking strategy and strategic missions as far as what happened. But you see a different president than we first left. Now, the president was indeed frazzled right from the start. He's kind of trying to process everything that's happening, and he's realizing that all these talks are real time at this point. Aboard this aircraft, he begins to show signs of insanity, immediate signs of guilt. He realizes that everything that has been done, he's a part of that. His decision-making process has brought him to this point. So this is the first time in McCammon history that I actually dog-eared a book. On page 111, you see some vital data information that you will see exactly replicated on page 919 and 920 in chapter 92 at the end of our book. And that is basically the onset of the data that the president enters into the tactical long-range nuclear sanitizer, which is basically the doomsday machine. So I thought that was a very interesting take also, because that is a very realistic visual for those that have grown up in the last 50 years. This is all of the continual information you hear time and time again. So all of these pictures, from this data room to the complex to the last ride on the Air Force One, as all of the important advisors are taken in and protected, that all just made perfect sense to me. So that then segues us into the rest of our story. From chapter 12 forward, we are really coupled with characters that continue to just stay side by side and help each other through different misadventures, leading everyone up to their inevitable purpose. So unfortunately, when we last left Kansas, Swan's mom had passed. So that left her in the care of Josh. Josh took over as kind of a surrogate father for Swan. Now Swan again is only 9 years old. Sister Creep, as stated, made her way out of New York into New Jersey, and from New Jersey she started to head towards Pittsburgh, where she meets up with a man named Doyle. Now Doyle is in fact a man in disguise. He claims that he is a priest who preys on the dying and the dead, and so this allots for him to get closer to Sister. Now Sister inevitably loses the latter part of her name, Creep, and just takes on the form of Sister during this next phase. And I think that again is a biblical reference to like a nun, because of course when we first meet her, she's homeless, she's on the streets, she's a little more than just a vagabond, though. She really is you know, kind of a scrapper, just trying to maintain and keep ends met so she can survive. She's a survivalist. And here she has met up with another survivor named Artie, and as they're encountering Doyle, he realizes that this is the man who's been following her since New York City, and is in fact the man with the scarlet eye. Once again, she manages to escape. Now back at Blue Dome, we do finally start to see the collaboration of Colonel Macklin and Roland, and then of course Macklin has the remaining surviving army. Now initially when the nuclear war begins, or World War III begins, there is still a multitude of soldiers, but you have to understand with the blast, a good portion of that number was injured. And with nuclear fallout, which is basically like a radioactive dust that sticks onto living particles, living neurons, and that allots for this particle or matter known as gamma. And gamma is very dangerous for years to come. They say that after a nuclear blast, it is very unsafe to go out for several hours after the fact. But this really got me thinking about yet another conspiracy. Now the act itself actually happened, but there is a conspiracy that lies within, and that is Chernobyl, which ironically was in Ukraine, the SSR, Soviet Union. And this happened just, what, 33 years ago. In 1986, there was a facility known as Chernobyl that a nuclear blast did occur. 31 people died, but where the conspiracy comes in is that it states, although to this day it is locked down, the facility is no longer operational, they don't allow people in, it's actually heavily guarded on the outside, but they say that it can't be seen all the time, that eyes, you know, look away, and it's not as heavily guarded as one would think. So not all of the people had gotten out, and there are still people within this compound that experience nuclear fallout and are living in a very ravaged genocide type world where it's basically survival of the fittest. So I've heard different theories on this, that they're kind of their own population, you know, they kept them in there, they had to be humane, so they throw them like live meat and stuff like that. I mean, the stories are absolutely ridiculous. There was actually even a horror film made on it, Chernobyl Diaries, in which they take on a vampiric state. So if you're interested in that, I definitely say, you know, take a gander at it, because it does have to do with apocalyptic, but from a very different sense. But going back to Colonel Macklin, so he has soldiers that, of course, that got wounded in the initial onset of the war, but they're also going to have where you're starting to see people getting sick, because if they survived and they no longer have the compound intact as it was originally supposed to be, they're going to start breathing in or being exposed to these gamma elements, and people are going to start showing signs of it and spreading it within the compound. So as stated, Josh and Swan are now traveling together. They managed to get out of the situation they were in by crawling through a gopher hole, and they go on an expedition. Now this expedition lasts for, they kind of reference to it around chapter 34, and they give a date for the first time since the July 17th incident, which it's often referred back to as just simply 17th of July. And at this point, August 23rd, they're 1 month and 6 days after the bombing. That is the last reference of time that you hear until you hear the severe after effects around the 400-page mark, which is about 7 years later. So Josh and Swan have made it to Sullivan, and here they meet another important character by the name of Leona. Now Leona is caring for her husband Davy, who is sick on his deathbed. He, of course, has the after effects of radiation poisoning. And Leona is special because she is kind of into the black magic, the Santeria, whatever you want to refer to it as, where she is able to tell the future through globes, and she does tarot card readings. And she does a tarot card reading with Swan. Swan finds her room, becomes very curious, asks a lot of questions. And so Leona says, you know, hey, can I read your future? When she's flipping over the cards, she predicts with a card that faces up of the devil that she will in fact face the devil, not knowing that this is going to segue in the man with the scarlet eye. Another prolific part here is Swan also befriends a stray terrier that we learn to know is, whom we learn to know as Killer. Afterwards, Swan and Josh, along with Killer, make their way to a town called Matheson, and it is here that they stop at a little farming community. Swan at some point separates herself from Josh. She finds her way into this cornfield, and in the cornfield she finds a horse by the name of Mule. So it was a little confusing at first because I kept thinking donkey, but Mule and Killer will end up being a very important part of Swan's life because time and time again they ensure her safety. Now going back to Sister and Artie here, and there will be a lot of back and forth because again there's a lot of situations going on, but they all integrate into one centralized meeting place. So Sister and Artie began making their way westward. They find a cabin in the woods where there are more survivors. This becomes very essential for their overall mindset because it gives them hope in a place where they're starting to lose hope. Flipping back over to Macklin and Roland, we find them now near Salt Lake City, Utah. They gravitate to this area because it is said that the salt in the water is going to be a cleansing of sorts. Everyone is gravitating towards this because whatever onsets that they're feeling from the nuclear fallout, this salt water is going to cleanse them. So a great number of these survivors of the nuclear holocaust have found their way to Utah. What we find in Utah, however, is a division of two kinds of people. You have dirt warts and you have regulars. Now the dirt warts are where Macklin and Roland reside. And then you have the regular people. Now regular people are people with guns, ample supply of food, water, and any other resources to get them through. However, the regulars are headed by a man known as the Fat Man. Find that the Fat Man, who is Freddie Kempa, is in fact a pedophile. He's very interested in Roland, so he befriends or tries to befriend Roland and Macklin very early on, But McCammon is very insistent that they are nothing like the regulars, and he forms this army, the AOE, or the Army of Excellence. He is hell-bent and determined to ensure that the Army of Excellence becomes the top protector and the top organization in this new world. So anytime he comes up against another group that he feels is competitive in any way, or might have more resources, or might be better than them, he immediately tries to find some preemptive strike to go in, steal their resources, gather as many men from that side, and build his army bigger and stronger with more guns and ammo, and essentially the military mindset. It is within this meeting that they stumble across Sheila Fontana. Now, Sheila also becomes kind of a secondary character who inevitably lasts through the duration of the story. She is nothing more than a whore. She comes to us by way of introduction through her and her pimp were walking along, and they were kind of taking care of each other up until she comes into contact with McCammon and Roland. Rudy, who was her caretaker or pimp, ends up succumbing to his death along with that of a small child, a newborn child. The child and Rudy are murdered to ensure that she can go on in this organization. She does have a bag full of narcotics. These narcotics consist of cocaine, LSD, amongst other things. And this is really her way of being able to pay for things or get through things. Now, when she comes across McCammon and Roland, she doesn't realize that her profession of trade, being a lady of the night, is actually going to be what they're looking for. This then becomes Roland's first sexual encounter, and she kind of takes care of the whole upper regime of the AOE. Now, the fat man does succumb to face his final death. Roland kills the fat man by burning his face with a kerosene lamp, in addition to shooting him and beating the crap out of him. Something inside Roland just rages when Freddie comes on to him. He and Freddie are locked into a room for a few minutes, and he's making advances, kind of making it seem as though he can give him more power and more control than McCammon has offered him. But in the back of his mind, McCammon is king and he serves the king. So the fat man does succumb to his death. Josh and Swan at this point are still moving along. They do in fact make it to Matheson. They find a local Kmart, which helps them to stock up on some additional supplies. And it is here at that Kmart that Leona's purpose does come into play, because she does end up giving her life up to save Swan. It is shortly after this altercation at Kmart that Josh, Swan, the horse mule, and the terrier killer come upon an abandoned circus train and a man by the name of Rusty. Now, Rusty ends up staying with them for a good portion or duration of the story. He is an ex-rodeo rider, and also either he was in charge of the clowns or he was in fact a clown himself. But we're now 7 years into this, and all of the circus people have died off. Just 2 days prior to Josh and Swan meeting Rusty, he says the last survivor of this circus had died. So he was very welcoming of Josh and Swan, took them under his wing. And it is here for the first time that we start to talk about the after effects of the nuclear onset of that fallout. So we start to hear things like tumor-like growths, the graying of the skin, fleshy helmets. There's hard times with breathing, with speaking, with sight. So you kind of almost get this cocoon-like impression of what's growing over their faces. But the irony of it is, although it does appear in a cocoon-like state, it still does leave an opening at the mouth and in the nostrils. So you are able to breathe and still eat, but your sight becomes less and less and your speaking becomes harder and harder. We also hear of what is known as then the nuclear winter. Ever since the war began, we went into a nuclear winter, and the sun literally had not come out since. So we have loss of sunlight, which inevitably loss of sunlight, and sunlight is so important for not only growth and restoration, but also for the human body. The human body craves sunlight to heal and to warmth, to sustain. So although people will say you don't need sunlight to survive, really honestly stop and think how much sunlight does for you. The AOE at this point has grown to over 4,000, but keep in mind with each conquer there is still loss of life. So they maintain about 3,000 to 4,000. When they took on their last big takeover, which was kind of like a religious cult that was headed up by Brother Timothy, and of course there is a multitude of cast of characters. Brother Timothy claims that God in fact sheltered them for a few days on a mountaintop, and it was there that he had a silver key and a black box, and the silver key goes into the black box, inevitably destroying the world. So here once again we have a religious tie-in, because as we all know there are those fanatical religious cults out there. But just like in every crazy thing, there is always an underlying hint of truth in there. With religious cults, they become fanatical because they skew the truth. They take a bit of truth and they form it and shape it to accommodate whatever their religious practices and beliefs are. So they take the basis of an underlying foundation of religion, whether that be Christianity, which it is in most cases, and then they formulate these ideas and principles on top of that. So as Macklin's hearing this, he just thinks it's garbage and rubbish, but Roland is asphyxiated with it, and he keeps honing in on this silver key and this black box. He wants to know who God is, what mountain he's referencing, and where this is. So he basically at this point, for the first time, becomes insistent that Macklin listen to him and that he takes charge of this mission. So they do inevitably stronghold this cult-like religion, take Brother Timothy into custody, and they go on a quest to find God, the silver key, and the black box. It is also here that you see a breakdown between Macklin and Roland for the first time. So you've got to imagine 7 years later, Roland is now about 20 years old, on the cusp of being about 21. And Macklin is deteriorating, not in the sense that he's just getting older, which he is, but he's also showing onset signs of nuclear fallout in addition to Roland. They're both showing these cocoon-like features, but it's weighing harder on Macklin, who has always had a sense of vanity. Now, Sister is still making her way through the Midwest. She comes across this group of young boys who are from an orphanage, which is led by a 17-year-old boy by the name of Robin Oakes. Now, Robin Oakes will become very important at the end of our story. And here, we for the first time get a glimpse of a doctor in the mix. Now, a doctor is very important. In any respect, you want people of all professions, but it's here that you start to hear for the first time there is someone in their craft. Now, he's not the best doctor. He was a surgeon. He hasn't practiced in obviously well over 7 years. But we have a young boy who has been shot and needs immediate surgery. So she takes a spike out of that glass ring to help the doctor operate on Robin's younger brother. Ring eventually leads this entire group to a town called Mary's Rest. Mary's Rest is savaged. They are surviving off of rats. But it inevitably becomes the seedling for the creation of the new world. It is here that we're getting very close to Sister finding her quest. So Sister has been having these dream walks by holding this jewel-encrusted ring, and she knows that it's leading her somewhere to someone. So at this point, Swan, who is about 16 now, Josh and Rusty are basically traveling entertainers. They use that circus premise to perform magic, and of course Josh wrestles as a way to kind of integrate themselves into these new towns and situations. It is here in Mary's Rest that for the first time Swan shows the green thumb ability from years prior. She comes across this tree that is left standing. It's referred to as the lone tree. She walks up to the tree and she puts her hand on it. She starts to feel life within it. and she concentrates very heavily, inevitably placing the mark of her name within the tree. It is the next day that the farmer who owns this tree discovers the tree has sustained life. Well, really, Swan breathed life into this tree. But we also hear for the first time what the onset of the nuclear fallout has done to Swan. She has it probably the worst of any characters that we've heard of, as she can barely see. She's on the cusp of becoming blind, and she can barely speak. Really, the only people that can understand her are Josh and Rusty, and really Rusty has a very difficult time. We still are hearing of this man with the scarlet eye, who is kind of, at this point, you know, although referred to as such, is the devil. And he's searching for Sister because he still wants that magical glass ring. He knows there's powers within it, and he starts to hear stories about Swan because of this apple tree. So he decides at that point that they are both a threat to him, and he wants to head now to Mary's Rest. Now, it's also within Mary's Rest that we hear of Swan finding the body of a child, and the child was in the process of planting corn before he died. So she takes over the planting of the corn. So now we have in Mary's Rest the development of an apple tree and a very large crop of apples and corn that started to grow. So in a world that has literally been barren for 7 years, has had no light, and then to have the production of something as delicious as an apple and as supple as corn, which corn can be used in so many facets, there is a lot of promise in this once desolate place that people look down upon. It is also here that Swan and Robin integrate for the first time and really begin to fall in love. Now, Swan has to move on with Josh as they move out of the town. They don't get to succumb to the fruit of their labor, so to speak. Now, another beauty of the man with the scarlet eye, and this is where I will throw in my 2 cents about the correlation or the connection that I'm sure many of you are thinking. For the first time, when the man with the scarlet eye introduces himself as friend to the AOE, I started to get flag representation. I'll admit, when I first started this story out, I was very bitter. I was very upset because I really thought, okay, we have another stand on our hands. I actually had to walk away from the story for a little bit because I didn't want to read a carbon copy story. I'm so glad that I put my head on straight and I came back to the story, because there really is such a difference between the two stories. I know there's a continuing conversation that there are extreme similarities between The Stand and Swan Song, and there are. But if you really take the differences and you set them aside, you do have an overall evil entity. But this entity cannot do things alone. Even the man with the scarlet eye, no matter how much power he possesses, no matter how much he can get inside the head of others, which is similar to what Flag was able to do, he still can't do it alone. He references that inevitably the fate of the end will be done at human hand. He himself will not do this. So if you were anything like me and you saw those similarities, you know, I certainly can understand why, but please understand that these are two very different stories, where in The Stand you are dealing with a virus, and here you are dealing with something potentially just as real, but it's a nuclear war. So they very much stand apart, and they're both very much a heavy character driven story, but they're so beautiful in their own merit that we really need to stop comparing the two, because just because they both have a numerical timeline to start off with and they're cut into parts and pieces, there's no replication between the two. Now, there is also one very important part that I want to mention before we kind of jump into the very tail end of this story. In chapter 7, there is a situation where Swan is asked to come and take a look at a small boy. This small boy apparently had a disfigurement prior to the nuclear beginnings. And his father is going on and he's explaining that his son, the gentleman's name is Caden, that he's changed. You know, although his cocoon has opened and he's blossomed, he feels like the face of his son looks like the face of his soul. And that stuck with me for the rest of the story, because as these Job's masks began to formulate and crust off and fall off, and you start to see the assimilation of what the after effects of this nuclear war are, people start to take on the faces of what I believe their actual soul looks like. There's disfigurement in Macklin, there's disfigurement in Roland. They don't really ever become human again. Macklin is even referred to as almost skeletal at one point. Both become these beast-like creatures. So it stands to reason that this man with the scarlet eye, he's never really fully fledged. He doesn't have a full form. But it makes me think that anybody that chooses to follow him is never going to be whole. They're never going to be true. So let's encapsulate this ending very quickly. We're several weeks into Mary's rest. The supplies are running out with the AOE, and they really are on a mission to get to this silver key and black box. So of course, as you know, they do have Tommy in custody. At this point, the man with the scarlet eye has met up with Sister and with Swan. They have taken them into custody, and they are all heading up to this bunker that belongs to God. Now, Macklin has had a complete breakdown, and it's at this point that Roland decides to give his allegiance to the man referred to as friend. Brother Timothy guides everyone up to this bunker, and while they're there, Sister notices that God's cufflinks are the former president of the United States. So now we've completely come full circle. So here we are at what is God's bunker. I'm still envisioning Blue Dome Mountain, but we are at the top of this mountain. The bunker has the system known as Talons. It is a tactical long-range nuclear sanitizer. So from the beginning, where chapter 11 basically ends with this data, you have the segue now into chapter 92, page 919, 920, where that same data is being entered into the Talons, and it's basically a doomsday device that is setting up these code words starting with A-OK. So here we go back 100% full circle from chapter 1 to the end here. Now Swan is processing all this information in her head. Sister is working with her as well. So they make a fantastic team. Unfortunately, Swan and Sister do get detached from Josh at some they do get detached from Josh and Rusty. So although we think that there is no possible rescue, because at some point they do get locked in this bunker, inevitably Swan is able to figure out the deactivation sequence by, again, another religious tie-in. So she's coming to the question, how does a prayer end? How does a prayer end? And I'll say, as a religious woman myself, I did not get the answer to that question. Amen. I was kind of disappointed in myself. But her and Sister are able to escape. Unfortunately, Sister succumbs to a gunshot wound, and inevitably they are able to leave the bunker, and through the deactivation process, Swan does hold the silver key. The beauty and the ending of the deactivation process and holding the key that inevitably was to be the key of final destruction. There was a statement that was given by Brother Timothy prior to his death, and he says, "The last of the good must die with the evil. Evil must die so that the world can be reborn. You must die, and you, and me, and even Swan." But Swan survived. So you always will have this epic battle of good and evil. But as Swan, who is the epitome of the good in the story, holds the key to the destruction of Earth, she throws the key into the water, inevitably causing ripples and awakening eggs of tadpoles. So that key of destruction becomes the key of life. So it's really the perspective on how you choose to look at things. Do you choose to see that your glass is half empty, or your glass is half full? Do you choose to focus on the negative, or do you want to see the positive in that? Do you want to focus on the ugly, or do you want to see the beauty? I love that. Swan and Robin, of course, eventually make it back to Mary's Rest after Swan has kind of helped to rebuild the world. And they inevitably settle their love, get together, and have a set of twins that they name Joshua and Sister. I just thought that was a really incredible ending. And I know I mushed it up really fast, but like I said, there was a lot to go over, and there was still so much that I didn't say. So overall, I give this book 5 stars. The reason I love apocalyptic horror is because it is a real horror that lives within each of us. Much like other apocalyptic stories I have read in the past, it takes so much to terrify me. I honestly don't scare easily. Ghosts don't scare me. Haunted house stories don't scare me. But apocalyptic horror scares me because it has the inevitable possibility of being real someday. We could potentially go into World War III. We could potentially someday see a nuclear war. We could go to war with Russia. We could obtain viruses. There are so many facets to these stories that could potentially be real, and that is what makes this one of the best horror stories of all time. 5 incredibly high-marked stars. Shall we pick a new read? All right, got one here. Oh, we're back to the king. Needful Things, March 1st. I'll see you here. Until next time, friends, I'll see you real soon. Take care. Bye.